It is incredibly difficult to talk about Dark Souls 2 for quite a few reasons. For those that know me, it is most likely very apparent that I'm a huge fan of the series. To put it in perspective for those who do not know me, the sole reason I'm considering buying a PS4, an investment of at least $400, is to be able to play Bloodborne, Miyazaki's latest work, on release. Demon Souls caught my attention, Dark Souls stole my life, and unfortunately, Dark Souls 2 was disappointing. Before we delve into the meat of this ordeal, though, I would like to clarify what I'm saying here. I think it is pretty mandatory that I do, given the critical acclaim the game has received from most sources, and its fairly widespread success across the multiple platforms that it supports. Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game. The disappointment largely stems from the fact that it, simply put, does not live up to the legacy that its predecessors have established. The myriad of issues I have with the game, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, put such a large damper on my enthusiasm that I found it hard to continue at points, even if the rest of the game was a shining example of what games could be with enough care invested in them. Anyway, with that out of the way, onward to the question that, as always, we strive to answer. Is Dark Souls 2 any good? Dark Souls 2, from the very start, curses the player. The player character tosses himself into a whirlpool of unknown magical origin that, for lack of a better term, teleports them to Drangleic, the land which people go hollow and memories seem to be as fleeting as my interest in games that are released by Blizzard. The only chance the player has to fight the curse, and as a result remain human, is to collect the 4 primal souls and then confront the King of Drangleic. In this process, the player will also be tasked with collecting lots of normal souls, the game's currency and soul way to level up. The catch is that upon death, which is rather inevitable in a game of this nature, you lose all the souls you've collected and not spent, and must retrieve them from the spot the death took place. Fail in this, and those souls are gone. Permanently. Much like its predecessors, exploring is a key element of the game. It requires patience, a fast hand, and the willingness, at times, to take risks to achieve higher rewards. Fog gates still pepper the landscape at fairly regular intervals, the opposite side having equal chances to house a boss, a bonfire, or just another part of an endless dungeon to explore. Even approaching a fog gate can be a trying experience. Deciding whether or not you're ready to face the unknown is truly stressful, and the relief when it proves to be nothing more than another room is palpable. The terror at discovering a boss is usually fairly overwhelming too, but slightly less so, since the presence of a boss is usually announced by a plethora of summon signs littering the outside of the gate. In this rendition, the developers have also taken to trolling players at every opportunity. I've opened doors to find a blank wall behind them, or, worse, opened doors to find an endless abyss, or a prompt death by ambush. The world design takes unexpected turns wherever and whenever possible, and, as a result, From Software has managed to keep exploring, exciting, as new twists continue to pop up all the time. Thankfully, it's much easier this time around to make use of friends, too, and assistance in exploration through jolly cooperation. Combined with Dark Souls 2's use of Steamworks, dedicated servers, and even in-game items, playing with friends has never been easier in a Souls game. I would like to point out, however, that lag in both PvE, player versus environment, and PvP, player versus player, is still a very real issue. From my own experience, as well as many of those I've read on forums around the web, people believe that the dedicated servers are solely for the purpose of matchmaking, with everything after the initial connection being handled on a peer-to-peer connection. This means that, especially in PvP, the lag backstabs are a very real issue, and teleporting players has not been an uncommon sight for me. Also making their return is the game's signature bonfires. While exploring, the player will periodically come across these safe havens, which allow the rejuvenation of health, resupply of valuable Estus flasks, the game's health restoration potions, and perhaps most important, the ability to fast travel to other bonfires that have already been activated. The ability to fast travel is unlocked from the moment you find your second bonfire, and serves as a link between the deepest dungeons and Majula, the hub where the player can find merchants, the Emerald Herald, whose sole purpose is to improve the Estus flask and allow the player to level up, and the entrances to other portions of the world. True to From Software's previous designs, each of the NPCs located in the hub sport fully voice-acted dialogue, and a mysterious tale that explains their arrival and involvement in the events surrounding Drangleic. Perhaps more importantly, if you fulfill certain prerequisites and exhaust all of their dialogue, Some of the NPCs even give the player items that can prove exceptionally useful. The use of fast travel in Majula's hub structure showcases From Software's attempt to streamline some of the game's existing systems, and as one of the most apparent faults. While fast traveling through Bonfires is useful and convenient, it also takes away from Dren Lake feeling like a true open world, especially in the early stages of the game. Each dungeon leads along a specific path that is essentially a linear line until the player vanquishes the final boss at its end. Upon completing this task, the Primal Bonfire immediately transports the player back to Majula, which then allows the player to try another one of the dungeon paths. One of the best qualities of Dark Souls was how each area felt connected, and finding the shortcuts between areas, even after hundreds of hours of playing, allowed the player to constantly feel like they were improving. The lack of connection between each area in Dark Souls 2 left me feeling like each spoke off of Majula was trying to tell its own story, rather than connecting them to the overarching narrative. Dark Souls 2 also fails to push its most advertised change to gameplay, the use of torches. I did not even know how to light a torch outside of using a flame butterfly until my second playthrough. This could be a result of my own stupidity, but it had hardly any impact on my progression either way. Even the game's areas that were designed to be genuinely dark, like the gutter, were only minorly inconvenient without the use of a torch. Plus, I would much rather retain the ability to defend myself with a shield while sacrificing further visibility than gain the ability to light the torches that dot the darker areas. After all, once the final boss dies, more than likely the player will rarely be returning to areas like the gutter anyway. The gnarliest issue I have with the game stems from taking damage when an enemy is stunned. What causes this issue is unknown to me. I've seen everything from claims that people need to get good to the fact that the game was designed to run at 30 frames per second, and as a result of running at 60 frames per second, animations don't always play properly. Either way, there are times, especially with certain enemies, that the player will cause the enemy's poise to break, thus making them stumble and leaving them open for attack, but the player will still take damage from an attack from the stumbled enemy. Dark Souls was always a showcase of firm but fair approach to games, with every hit I took being an example of something I could do better. However, in these cases in Dark Souls 2, I have at times perished because an enemy who is clearly playing a stumble animation has decided that he just really wanted my head on a platter, and as a result used his telepathic mind abilities to explode my brain. The framerate issue also causes weapon durability to function improperly. Running at 60 frames per second actually causes weapons to decay at twice the rate they do if playing at 30 frames per second. Plus, tying invincibility frames during dodge rolls to a stat was a stupid decision of the highest order. Thankfully, Dark Souls 2 still supports New Game Plus, and this time around actually supports a few changes to the game when entering it. NG Plus adds new enemies to most locations, increased stats on monsters, adds some new boss mechanics, and a bunch of new items. Overall, the new iteration of NG Plus is pretty darn cool, in most spots. Unfortunately, From Software at times places new enemies in areas where, to be completely honest, they were entirely unnecessary. Seriously, it was hard enough to fight 5 guys at once. I don't need or want to fight 10 instead. On the technical side of things, the PC port this time around is also leagues better than the original Dark Souls port. While the first game was a direct port from console, and required a mod to even run at a decent resolution, Dark Souls 2 supports a wide array of features that should satisfy even the most fanatical PC gamer. Natively, the game supports resolutions up to 1440p, as well as settings to control texture quality, anti-aliasing, SSAO, and more. I rarely had any framerate dips below 60, and that was running on both my desktop with a GTX 770 and on my secondary computer which sports a 550 Ti. I said at the beginning of this video that Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game. The statement holds true, but as someone who dedicated hundreds of hours to its predecessors and wanted to explore every nook and cranny of their fascinating lore, world, and enemies, Dark Souls 2, in general, just seems to fall short. Since its release back in April, I've barely passed the 100-hour mark, which for a game that I love as much as Dark Souls is a bit sad. I desperately wanted to love the game, but all the little issues just piled up, and eventually I just had to put it down and return to previous iterations that had, and still do, capture my imagination much better. Dark Souls 2 from Software gets a 7.5 out of 10, and is available for $49.99 or your regional equivalent. Until next time, stay awesome, and cheers.